Human Devolution, a Vedic Alternative to Darwin's Theory. And basically, what I presented is an explanation of that verse from Bhagavad Gita, but in scientific terms. Mamaimam so jivaloke jivabhuta sanatana manasastani driyani prakritishtani karshati. The self, the soul, is eternal. It exists apart from matter. It's part of God. But now it has come in contact with matter in its gross and subtle forms, but we should be trying to restore consciousness to its original pure state. I'm a researcher in human origins for the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. And I look at my work in this area as part of my Bhakti yoga. Yoga means connecting with a higher cause. Bhakti yoga means connecting to the highest cause, Krishna, through bhakti or devotion. So part of devotional service, part of bhakti yoga, means taking your talents and abilities and using them in Krishna's service. Whatever ability one has, it can be used in Krishna's service. So my study of these questions related to consciousness and the origins of our human origins is influenced by my studies in the Vedic literature, especially Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, and other Vaishnava texts, especially Srimad Bhagavatam, the Bhagavad Purana. Now, it may seem unusual in the modern days to mix one's study of scientific questions with spirituality. But I have found many scientists are very interested to hear Vedic perspectives on consciousness and mind and human origins. And one nice thing about the Vedic teachings is that they're harmonious with the teachings of many of the world's other great spiritual traditions. So I've been invited to present my Vedic perspectives on human origins at some of the leading scientific institutions in the world, like the Royal Institution in London, the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow, the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, and many other institutions throughout the world. So the question I'm dealing with tonight, and in this book, Human Devolution, is where did we come from? We should first of all ask, what are we? We should know what it is we're trying to explain. If we don't know what we are, we can't even begin to ask, where did we come from? So today, many scientists will say that a human being or any other living thing is just a very complex machine made of molecules. That's all there is to it. And, for example, Richard Dawkins, a prominent English scientist, says, "We are survival machines, robot vehicles, blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes." It's a very materialistic conception of the self. And what about consciousness? Well, they say, well, if you combine the chemicals in the brain in a very complex way, they will generate consciousness. But as soon as you disorganize the chemicals, no more consciousness, no more love, no more self, nothing. this is a very common idea in science today, that as conscious beings, we evolve up from matter. Matter produces consciousness, they say. So basically, they just say, we are machines made of matter. That's all we are. And our mind, our consciousness, that's just some chemicals interacting in the brain, temporarily. Now from the Vedic literature, we get another idea, that a human being is not just a combination of material elements. That's part of what a human being is. That's what the external covering of the self is made of. Matter, molecules. But beyond that, there is a subtle mind element with some very unusual powers. And beyond that, there is a conscious self that is non-material. It can exist apart from the body. So it's a different worldview. The modern materialistic scientific worldview is saying matter produces consciousness. But the Vedic worldview is saying consciousness is not produced by matter. It is separate from matter, but it can become covered by matter. Now, I'm not the only one who's saying things like this. This is Rodney Brooks, who was with the Artificial Life Lab at MIT, one of the top technological institutes in the world. You know, mind is something like air. We can't see air, but when air moves over an element we can see, like water, we can observe the effect of the air on water. We can see waves forming. So similarly, we cannot see mind. Mind is invisible. But some scientists have observed the very unusual effects of mind on ordinary matter. This, and then beyond that, there is the conscious self. Now, there is some scientific evidence for these things, but it's not very well known because of a process of knowledge filtration that operates in the world of science. So I'm going to start, by giving some evidence that scientists have reported for a subtle mind element that has some very unusual powers. Now, like in India, it's understood that at different points in history, there were yogis who, by their mental power, could do unusual things. Many people don't realize that even Western scientists have studied such things. I'll give some examples from the history of Western science. This is Alfred Russel Wallace. He was the co-founder of the theory of evolution, along with Darwin. Actually, the theory of evolution used to be called the Wallace-Darwin theory. Now it's only called the Darwin theory. And the reason for that is Wallace became involved in investigating mystic powers. And Darwin didn't like that, so he pushed him away. So now the theory is just called Darwin's theory. But Wallace was joined in his work by another British scientist, Sir William Crookes, who was president of the Royal Society. That was England's topmost scientific organization. So these two prominent English scientists were investigating mediums. Now, mediums are people who possess some of these powers that, say, yogis might possess in India. One of the mediums they studied was Daniel Douglas Hume, and he had some unusual powers. You know, for example, he could take an accordion and he could hold it with one hand opposite the key. So he could hold it with one hand and it would play very complex tunes. So these two scientists, Wallace and Crookes, thought they should do some testing of him. So they thought, okay, maybe he's using a trick instrument. So they went and bought a new musical instrument that he never touched before. And then they thought maybe somehow like a magician, he's just getting his hands down there and he's playing the keys. So they made a cage. You know, he had to hold the instrument with one hand like this. This was their experimental setup. He would have to hold the instrument with one hand in the cage so he couldn't touch it with his other hand or with his feet or anything. And under those conditions, he was still able to cause the instrument to play very complex tunes without touching the keys at all. And it doesn't stop there. Both of these scientists said they observed him take his hand out of the cage, and the instrument was floating in the cage, playing complex tunes all by itself, just by his mental power. So, why would these two top English scientists say something like that and report it to their scientific colleagues? I think they did that because that's what they observed. Now, another thing both of these scientists observed were levitations by Hume. Now, we know that magicians can perform the illusion of a levitation. It requires some apparatus and some assistant. But these scientists were aware of that. So they conducted their research in a different way. They would go to Hume's apartment in London and they would say, come with us right now. Don't take anybody with you. Just you. You come with us right now. And they would bring him someplace he had never been before, where there was no opportunity for him to make some apparatus and have some people to help him. They would take him to the home of some English scientists, just like you're all gathered here. You know, they would bring him into the middle of the room, and then he would rise into the air in the middle of the room. And this happened more than once. And they, you know, Wallace said he felt all around him, everywhere. No wires, no ropes, nothing. And on one occasion, they had him on the 3rd floor of a building, and he levitated in a room. He went into a horizontal position. He floated out a window on the 3rd floor, and then came in another window in the horizontal position, and then assumed a vertical position. So these top English scientists reported these things several times to their colleagues. This is part of what I call the hidden history of science, you know, that you don't ever see mentioned in the textbooks. Most physics students learn about the work of Marie and Pierre Curie. They were husband and wife. They both got Nobel Prizes in physics for their work in discovering radium. see that in every physics textbook, introductory physics textbook. And especially Marie Curie is mentioned, because she was a very prominent woman scientist. So, what we don't see in the textbooks is that they were also investigating mystic powers possessed by mediums. They did 2 years of experiments with a medium named Eusapia Palladino, and the group that did the study included 5 Nobel Prize winners, including the Curies. This had Paris, early in the 20th century. And it happened in the Psychology Research Institute there. So, this woman had some amazing mental abilities. She could cause physical objects to float into the air in her presence. In other words, she had some lagima siddhi. They had her in the laboratory. She was sitting in a chair. Marie Curie was holding her hands. Other scientists were holding her feet. And in the middle of the room, like a large table, was floating in the air. And Pierre Curie was measuring how high it was floating in the air. He was timing, how long it was floating in the air. After 2 years of such results, the entire group of scientists signed documents saying these things are absolutely true. I take this as evidence for the existence of a subtle mind element associated with the human organism that can act on ordinary matter in some very unusual ways. There have also been some very interesting experiments in extrasensory perception. As I said, if you study the Vedic literature, you'll see a list of siddhis or mystic powers. One of them is called Durdarshan, which means the ability to see at a distance. Of course, that's the name of the Indian national television company, Durdarshan. But it's referring to a mystic power, that a siddhi that is described in the Vedic literature. So, there have been some interesting experiments in extrasensory perception. In these experiments, a person is put to a very relaxed state. Through the ears, they're hearing only white sound, white noise. Their eyes are covered, so they're not getting visual input. And they're put into a very relaxed state of meditation. Meanwhile, and that person is called a receiver. Then a second person in another location called the sender looks at an image randomly selected by a computer and tries to mentally send that image to the receiver. After each trial, the receiver is shown 4 images, one of which is the target image that the sender was trying to mentally send. Now, if there is no mystic effect, no paranormal effect, then you would expect, if you run this experiment thousands and thousands of times, the receivers will pick the correct image 25% of the time. That's the chance expectation. But the experimenters have found that the receivers pick the correct image at a rate greatly exceeding 25% of the time. So again, this is some evidence for a subtle mind element that can acquire information in ways that go beyond our current understanding. So, if we want to talk about human beings and where they come from, we can't just talk about the chemical elements. We have to talk about this subtle material mind element as well. Now, what about consciousness? Is there any scientific evidence for a conscious self that can exist apart from the body, apart from the brain, apart from matter? yes, there is. It comes from medical studies of out-of-body experiences. There are times when a person should be completely unconscious. For example, during a heart attack. The heart stops beating, blood stops going to the brain. Medical instruments show that the brain waves stop. At a time like that, a person should be completely unconscious. Yet many people in that condition report separating from their bodies, and then they look down and they see what the doctors and nurses are doing. To say now the descriptions given by the patients match the records kept by the doctors and nurses who have treated them. So in these cases, it appears that the Atma, the conscious self, temporarily separates from the brain, separates from the body, and then it re-enters the same body. Now this leads to another idea, namely that the conscious self can separate from one body and then enter a different body. This is called reincarnation, transmigration of the soul. So there is some scientific evidence for this. It comes from psychiatric studies of past life memories. Dr. Ian Stevenson and his colleagues from the University of Virginia Medical School studied thousands of cases of past lives reported by young children. And in over 800 cases, they were able to verify the existence of the person the child claimed to have been in the past life. For example, Carl Sagan, who's a prominent scientist, died a few years ago. He was skeptical about spiritual claims in science. But even he said in his book, last book, there are 3 claims in the extrasensory perception field which deserve serious study. 1, that by thought alone, humans can affect random number generators and computers. 2, that people under mild sense deprivation can receive thoughts or images projected at them. And 3, that young children sometimes report the details of a previous life. Now, I don't agree with him that those are the only 3 things that could be investigated, but those 3 things alone make the point I'm trying to make, that there is evidence for a subtle mind element with some very unusual powers, as the Vedic literatures say. There is some evidence for a conscious self that can exist apart from the body, go from one body to another body. There is some scientific evidence for these things. It's not that it's just stated in the Bhagavad Gita or the Puranas or Upanishads. There is some scientific evidence for it. So, if we want to understand what a human being is, we can't just say we're machines made of molecules. A human being is made of these 3 things: matter, subtle mind element, and a conscious self. And then this leads to another idea, that we live in a multi-level cosmos. The Vedic cosmology explains this. There's one level of the cosmos down at the bottom, dominated by ordinary matter. That's where we find ourselves now. It's inhabited by beings adapted to the conditions of life in contact with ordinary matter. That's our material world where we live right at this moment. Beyond that, there is a level of the cosmos dominated by the subtle material energies, mind, mental energies, intellectual energies. It's inhabited by beings adapted to the conditions there. We would call them devas, for example, demigods, or people in other cultures may have different names, angels, things like that. And then beyond that, there is the level of pure consciousness. You could say Brahman, but in scientific terminology, I would call it pure consciousness. And that region of the cosmos is inhabited by beings adapted to the conditions there, to life in the world of pure consciousness. So it's a multi-level cosmos. Now this may seem, inhabited by all different types of beings, ordinary life forms in the world of ordinary matter, demigod or deva forms in the world of subtle matter, and liberated beings in the realm of Brahman or pure consciousness. So this may seem a little bit unusual in modern science to speak about a multi-level cosmos inhabited by all different sorts of beings existing at the different levels, but there are some scientists today who are beginning to think about such things. This is a scientist who's come to accept ideas such as a multi-level cosmos inhabited by all sorts of beings. This is Dr. John Mack, who was head of the psychiatry department at Harvard University Medical School. He heard about things like this and he began investigating. And he wrote in his book, Passport to the Cosmos, "It appears ever more likely that we exist in a multidimensional cosmos. The cosmos appears to be filled with beings, creatures, spirits, intelligences, gods." So when he published that, his colleagues at Harvard tried to get him removed from his position. But he maintained his position. He successfully defended himself against them. So to summarize, as conscious beings, we begin our existence on the topmost level of consciousness, the level of pure consciousness, or to put it in Vedic terminology, the platform of Brahman or Vaikuntha. And it's their conscious selves exist in harmony with all other conscious beings and with the source of all conscious beings. However, if a conscious self becomes selfish, it can no longer exist in that harmonious state, and there must be some other place for it to act out its selfish activities. And some conscious selves, they come down to the level of subtle matter, and they remain there. And other conscious selves come further down into the world of gross, ordinary matter, where we find ourselves now, and they remain there for lifetime after lifetime. So this process by which the conscious self becomes covered by these lower energies of mind and matter is what I call devolution. Today, scientists believe that matter produces consciousness. They think we evolve up from matter. But I'm saying, no, we don't. We devolve or come down from pure consciousness. Matter does not produce consciousness, but consciousness becomes covered by matter. However, it's a process that can be reversed, and consciousness can be restored to its original pure state. So we begin with a form of pure consciousness, but it can become covered by the lower energies of mind and matter. But it is a process that can be reversed, and that's the actual purpose of human life, to restore consciousness to its original pure, eternal, sanatana state, beyond contact with matter and all its limitations, like birth, death, old age, and disease. So that original spiritual form pure consciousness is called the Swarupa, the real form, but now we identify with the temporary material covering. So within the system of Vedic culture, there are different systems of meditation and yoga that are meant to help us restore consciousness to its original pure state. And different other spiritual traditions also have similar things. But the point is that it has to work. It has to be scientific in this sense. Just like a geologist can tell us how to extract the element gold from its ore, where it's mixed with other less valuable substances. Now, once you have the gold in its pure form, you could stamp it with the symbols of different nations. You know, South African Kruger round, American gold dollar, English or Canadian dollar. But if it's really gold, if it's 100% pure gold, it doesn't matter what symbol that you stamped on it. It has its own value. But it really has to be gold. If by some process you can get that, then that is a genuine spiritual process. So, in the current age, the best process for purifying consciousness and restoring it to its original pure state is the chanting of the Hare Krishna mantra. Hare Krishna,
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare
Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So, in my books, I describe these things in detail. And really what they are is they're Bhagavad Gita classes for people interested in science. They're explanations of this verse from Bhagavad Gita, Mamaidam so Jiva Loke, Jiva Buddha Sanatana, Manasasthani Priyani, Prakajishtani Kashasi, where Krishna explains, you are a part of me. You are an eternal, conscious self, just as I am. But now you have come in contact with the material mind and the material body, and you're struggling with the material energy. So you need to stop that. You need to purify consciousness, come back to your original pure state, Sanatan state. And that is what the practice of Bhakti Yoga and the chief allows us to do. And the chief principle of Bhakti Yoga is the chanting of the Hare Krishna mantra.